Conversations with Grandfather. Preparation for the Supporting Prophecies, Volume number 5. Now, I've been wrestling where to take this, and the structure, how I first planned it in my mind was that between the third and the fourth prophecy, there was a period of silence. And basically, forgive me a second, Grandfather spent the next 4 days at the cave entrance, though for those 4 days nothing spoke to him, not even the earth. He said that it was a time of great sorrow, of aloneness, and a time to digest all that had taken place. Now, the interesting thing here is the next sentence states, he knew that these things would not appear in his lifetime, but they had to be passed down to the people of the future with the same urgency and power with which they had been delivered to him. Now, this is interesting because earlier on, and this is one of the things that I really wrestled with, and actually became a doorway for this little secret world, and I'll explain this in a minute. Initially, during the first prophecy, the spirit warrior said to Grandfather, you may never see these things in your lifetime. You see there, that spirit warrior factored in that sacred choice. The chain of events said that, there's a possibility that Grandfather could have seen this. And there's a possibility that Grandfather wouldn't see it. But when that spirit told Grandfather, you may never, and then here, after the second prophecy, he says he knew that these things would not appear in his lifetime. That confused me. Because after, and I mean months, if not better than a year, I said to Grandfather, the Spirit told you one thing, Grandfather, that you may never. And now, in those 4 days of silence, you're saying you wouldn't see them. What happened during that silence that forced you to believe or convinced you that you wouldn't see them? And he looked at me and he said, this silence is a place that you do not know yet. This silence is a place that you do not know yet. Now that was a seed. The soil was prepared during that time that the Spirit said, you may never. There was always that possibility that it could. But now, as if written in stone, he knew he would not see these events. And suddenly, he says this silence is a place that you do not know yet. And that's the thing, because I have never even broached that subject of silence with a class. The only other person I have ever talked about that silence with is one, Malcolm, and two, in a brief coyote discussion with Carl. And yet that silence is one of the most powerful elements of both our physical and spiritual existence. That silence will finally and ultimately be addressed and touched upon in what's called the soul of the shaman. But that led me to believe that Grandfather then, after he planted that seed and said that silence is a place, I started to mull that over, because as soon as he said that, it was an end of a conversation, a place that you do not know yet. Yet! You know, I hated when he did that, because you didn't know how long yet was. Yet could be a few hours. Yet could be a few years. Because he knew you had to get dirt time. You had to gain experience. You had to gain your own insight, your own visions, your own dreams to bring you to a place where you'd understand it. You know what's funny about silence? Because I first began touching it when I say to people, the sacred silence. And then, over the past couple of months, with all these preservation classes, I've suddenly started to say, not the sacred silence, but the silence that is sacred. And a few people catch it. They're two different worlds, two different parts of the same silence. But the interesting thing about that is that when you talk about the place of silence, he says he spent the next 4 days at the cave entrance, though for those 4 days nothing spoke to him, not even the earth. He said that it was a time of great sorrow, of aloneness, and a time to digest all that had taken place. You notice that he's talking of things outside of himself. The earth didn't speak to him. The spirit didn't speak to him. The spirit world didn't speak to him. Nothing spoke to him. So he had to turn inward. Like Grandfather's great quest on the desert, where he said, I wandered as if dead. Where the whole of creation turned its back on me. Where not an animal, a plant, the earth, the spirit, not even the Creator spoke to him. It was there in that time of one of his greatest visions, his fall ultimately from that cliff, that he was forced to go inward to that place which we all possess. This is the same place he talks about. I started to connect all these. I started to get this sense that something else was going on. but not outside of him. There was the voice of the warrior spirit. There was the voice of the child. There was the ever-presence of spiritual realms, worlds, spirits. There was the presence of the earth and the spirit that moves through all things. There was the presence of God during the Creator, that surrounded him through these four visions. But now, in between the four, in that transition period, that threshold, which we all stand upon right now, he went inward to a place of silence, a place of purity. And I realized, whoa, something happened in there. Something occurred. Something was further defined to move grandfather from this may never happen to this will not happen in my lifetime. With that kind of assurance. It was much later on that I realized in this place of silence where nothing outside of him spoke, came three other visions. And they came from the power of that silence. Whoa. Sacred silence. The silence that is sacred. The place of silence. The power of silence. And I learned that he had three visions. I'm always so inclined to call them supporting visions. I guess part of it in me is traditional. Because in each of those four visions, I can see a direction. One of the four sacred directions. It fits so beautifully into grandfather's teaching, so many Native American teachings. Then what about these three that didn't fit? Certainly, they would become part of the 7 arrows. So that would fit. And I began to mull over as I grew older and got more and more insights into this place, this power, this silence within that is sacred. I began to realize he talked of 3 visions. And as he slowly gave me pieces of these visions that for so long I called supporting visions, but as I've grown older, I realize they are just as important as the 4 major visions that they are based upon. That one was a vision that came from the silence of the flesh. One was a vision that came from the silence of the force within him. One was a vision that came from the spirit within him. And the final one, the one that goes beyond all the others, the vision I call hope, came from the silence of the void within him. But all from within him all from that place, that power. That silence that is sacred. That silence that as we're growing spiritually, at first is so hard to understand. Yet, in the final analysis, it is our source of greatest power, our greatest enlightenment, inspiration, dedication. As I said, I wrestled with how to approach this. And the logical in me said, okay, now start with the fifth prophecy, then the sixth, then the seventh, then the hope. In other words, start with the rock, end with the hope. And however many days it takes. But I realized that there's too much supporting information that is needed. There's got to be something else. There's got to be something that precedes it. There's got to be an understanding of that silence, of that purity, of that place of inspiration. What bothered me a bit was that, yes, the transition between the Spirit saying to grandfather, you may never see, to grandfather confidently saying, he knew that these things would not appear in his lifetime. That was contrary to what I was taught. Because this was written in stone. He was so sure. He knew. And that troubled me. That troubled me. Because I thought to myself, what happens if a starvation takes place now and the world takes notice? What if a disease breaks out tomorrow and the world takes notice? Grandfather would bear witness to it. He would see it. So there had to be an event in those three visions, those supporting visions, those clarifying visions, those empowering visions that said to grandfather, you have gone beyond that choice. It's ironic because if you count the days from the day that vision began to that midpoint, you're only dealing with a couple of days. Something happened in the world, or something happened within grandfather. And the more I research it, I don't think that it was something that happened in the world. It was something that happened within grandfather. A change in his way of thinking, a change in his visionary context, a change in his resolve. When he made that change, then he knew he would not see it. But as I look back, he loved so much at that point in his life to make the choice to follow the path, the new path that was presented to him, that he finally forsaked his people, his personal dreams, his personal comfort, and he walked in to aloneness, isolation, self-doubt, and suffered. You'll notice in reading the book Grandfather that at one point, he was about to give up his vision. I believe the man was even suicidal because he spent his life looking for someone to teach. And he'd encounter people for a little while, would learn from them, but they'd be like a flash in the pan. They'd be all gung-ho, and then that's it. Time after time after time. Letdown after letdown. No one to teach. Realizing that he had wandered for nearly his entire life, collecting this. For what? To die with him? He knew that if he went back to his people and not lived his vision, that he'd be living death. I think that point in time, Grandfather made that decision. In something like, I know what it was, but something like, for your benefit right now, I will follow that vision to the end. I will not run away. I will die trying. That's when it changed. He knew he would never see these things in his lifetime. I believe if Grandfather had not made that decision, then he would have seen these things in his lifetime. Because everything was back in place back then. First World War, the stench of coal-fired energy. It was all right in place. So, people ask me, what can I do? And I look at that and I say, wow, in that one decision, not to run, not to hide, not to take the easy way out, that one simple old man, by today's standards, penniless, homeless, I believe firmly changed the course of destruction and postponed it because his absolute, unwavering dedication to that vision. That was an unbelievable inspiration to me because he was so sure that, yet he wouldn't take credit. That change when he knew he would never see it, was that change that took place within him from that place, that power of silence. Now, Carl and I were wrestling about what to call this particular taping, and I realized that what this is, essentially what today is going to be, is preparing the foundation to understand the supporting philosophies. Because without it, without understanding the mechanism which goes into the silence that is sacred, that place of power, that you're not going to understand those three prophecies fully. Remember that these four basic ones that we've just gone through is where grandfather ended it, where he ended the whole scenario for a while. What, as I said, led me into it was when that spirit told grandfather, "You may never," and then grandfather midway through them said he knew he'd never. That's what set up the red flag, not right away, but eventually. That, whoa, there's something going on here, some mechanism. And it is then that grandfather, slowly but surely delivered those other three supporting prophecies, and ultimately the prophecy of hope. Now you might ask, okay, hope. Hope for us? No. Not on your life, hope for us. Hope for what happens after that fourth prophecy. Hope for what happens to the children of the earth. In that final part, supporting prophecy, it is basically what the children of the earth must do after the earth cleanses herself. It has very definite warnings of what not to do as a message to them. That final supporting prophecy of hope we can work toward, but we will not live. You're talking possibly 50, 70 years in the future after all the purging is done. However, our role, our vision, should be to pass that down to the children and grandchildren, which will be part of that new order. Now, the next step in this process of building the foundation of understanding for these supporting prophecies is something odd that most people do not pick up on. I've said in the story of grandfather and the fisherman that along about the age of 12 years old, Rick began to back out of the picture, mainly because Rick's father so hated grandfather and everything he stood for. Grandfather also prophesied that Rick would take a spirit journey on a white horse. He foretold Rick's death in that horseback riding accident. Now you got to remember that grandfather demanded unwavering passion that bordered on obsession. And along about the time 11, 12, 13 years old rolled around, Rick had lost much of that passion, that obsession, that dedication. Yes, certainly it had a lot to do with his father. Punishment and everything else that his father threatened him with. But I often think to myself, if Rick really wanted this bad enough, if he wanted it like I wanted it, he would have moved mountains to make it happen. And Rick didn't. I mean, oftentimes with my folks, the pressures of school and whatever else, I had to move mountains to make it happen. I had to take journeys to grandfather's camp when I was too tired to even walk 10 feet. But I wanted it that bad, and Rick didn't. So there was more going on there in Rick than just his father. Now, I start off this sentence. Grandfather had related the story to me in great detail during that night of the 4 prophecies. Do you think it's by accident that I did not say to us? Rick is there with me in the beginning of the journey to Prophecy Hill. He's there at the initial prophecy. But then Rick is not mentioned again. Until the end. Rick and I left a few hours later. Or grandfather left a few hours later, leaving Rick and me to wander alone without thought. I eventually wandered away from Rick. Rick went home. Just in the beginning of that first prophecy. We weren't into it. He came back at the end, after it was all over. And I look at that, and I look at the circumstances around Rick leaving that particular weekend. And I realize it's a transition in his life. He actually, knowing the circumstances of what was going on at home, he could have been there the entire weekend. In fact, he wouldn't even had to connive or move mountains or anything else. And I realized, looking back, that was a conscious choice Rick made. Rick chose to do something else other than be at grandfather's camp. Rick chose to go to a party that weekend. A big party? No. A small party. He didn't have to go. Half the people there he didn't know. But that was his choice. Now I wonder to myself, did grandfather have anything to do with it? In some roundabout way, did grandfather make it so that Rick would make the choice not to be there. Oh, grandfather fully intended to deliver those 4 prophecies that weekend. That was not by accident. As with everything in grandfather's life, it was shrewdly planned. So I believe to this day that yes, Rick made the choice, and a poor choice at that. But I think grandfather somehow spiritually added some fire to it. So Rick would make the choice to go, to get out of the woods. And I could tell with how grandfather presented these prophecies that Rick should not hear them anyway. They were that sacred to grandfather. He did not want to have them fall on the ears of someone unworthy. He did not want them to fall on the ears of someone who would do nothing with them. That's why for the longest time they were written in this manner. The masses would read it, an interesting read, but there was only a few that would take it and do something with it. Now comes the expansion, and people ask, well, Tom, how do you know that everybody that hears this tape, everybody sitting in this room right now is going to do something with it? And to tell you the God's honest truth, I don't give a damn. We're at war. We are losing a battle. I will do anything it takes to postpone the inevitable. It's not me to decide who is worthy of grandfather's prophecies. Grandfather was lucky. He had 2 students that he knew very, very well, better than family. He could be a clear judge of who is worthy and who isn't. I can't. But I know there were at that point of that threshold, that point of a decision. And as I said, I will do anything it takes for us as a global society to make the right decision. And my feeling is that if 10,000 people hear this tape and one person does something, then it's good. Then it's meant to be. For the rest, they can use it as a source of entertainment to a point where they feed on the charred remains of their grandchildren. And then the impact will come thundering back to them. So Rick wasn't there. I think it was planned. I think it was by design. Design outside of human choice. Because I look back in the year that preceded that night of the 4 prophecies, and in my own life, it was a year of testing. It was a year of strife, of struggle, of reaffirming values and vision. In my mind, it was like the world of spirit, the world of the force, the spirit that moves through all things. The very Creator was looking at me and saying, "Are you worthy?" That year, remember I said that we name years in the winter, like the winter of 100 slain. I have a name for that year. That year is called judgment. Followed by the year of choice, followed by the year of commitment. And it was horrible, because up until that time with grandfather, I had never felt anything like it. That harsh, soul-searching scrutiny, that judgment. I could feel it in the spirit world. I can feel it in the world of the spirit that moves through all things. I could feel it, sense it in the Creator. But I could really feel it in grandfather. And that scrutiny ended. That judgment ended the day that grandfather spoke his final word on prophecy. That night, his whole relationship to me changed. I could no longer feel him judging, but I could also sense the change in his attitude toward Rick. It was sad. Rick, part of his own flesh, there was that change. I'm not saying that grandfather no longer loved Rick. Of course he did. He just realized that Rick would not fulfill his greater vision and potential. You know, I said in one breath, it ended. That scrutiny, that judgment. True. It ended to that degree. Because it was a judgment, it was a scrutiny from all elements, flesh, force, spirit, and Creator. And grandfather, saying, "Are you worthy of this? Are you going to do something with this? Are you going to try to make a difference? Is it going to fall on deaf ears? Are you going to be like a flash in the pan, where you hear it, you start to do something, and then you let it go?" So that kind of scrutiny and judgment ended. But then, the following year, that year of choice, is also subtitled the year of testing. This is where things would come at me from out of nowhere. The old Murphy's Law, whatever can go wrong will go wrong. The Creator, the spirit world, the world of the spirit that moves through all things, grandfather, pushed me hard. So many times that year of testing, I wanted to quit. I wanted to turn my back. I wanted to walk away. As I tell people, I wish the path of a shaman on no one. It is a struggle. It is a commitment. It is lonely. It is wrought with testing. And tested I was. In the most bizarre ways. Sometimes not realizing I was being tested. You ever wonder? The story I sometimes tell at the standard class, the story of the little deer, the part crippled deer. I think I should recount this because it happened when I was 12 years old. That was one of the tests. Granted, in the Apache culture, in Grandfather's clan specifically, when a boy or a girl reaches 11, 12 years old, they are given the honor, a certain select individual, to hunt the meat for the elders, for the winter. And the prophecies had been delivered. That year of scrutiny and judgment had passed, and I was now into the year of choice and testing. Now, it doesn't sound like a big deal to hunt the elders' meat for the winter. But it is. You're honored. It is a rites of passage. You go from being a boy to a hunter, a warrior. You start on the path of a shaman. But it is the way the meat had to be hunted. Close range, meaning the weapon that you had to use had to be handheld. Rick and I had hunted before. My God, since the first week we met Grandfather, if we wanted to eat in the Pine Barrens, we collected edible plants or we hunted. We used traps. We used throwing sticks. We used atlatls. We used bows and arrows. We hunted everything from mice and fish and frogs up to deer, the largest game we have in the Pine Barrens. I remember that summer. Grandfather chose me to hunt his winter meat. That meat that would be dried and smoked and kept in the shelter to add to stews and whatever meat we could also hunt in the cold grips of winter. I was honored. I was flabbergasted because Rick should have been chosen. After all, he was Grandfather's kin. But Grandfather chose me. Wow. I had heard stories about this rites of passage. The glorification, the power, the honor and I was ready for it. The first thing I did was to make the killing weapon. My dad had brought me down from the northern part of New Jersey this magnificent piece of flint. We don't have it in the Pine Barrens. My dad used to think it's strange we had to go run parts either into upstate New York or way up in New Jersey that I asked for flint or jasper or something else. My brother had asked for a toy, He brought me back this beautiful piece of flint, and I had fashioned this gorgeous spear point out of it, 9.5 inches. I went out and I found a fire-killed oak, something 1.5 feet long, and I attached that blade to that oak. The whole thing might have been 2 foot, 2.5 foot long, very sturdy, and I presented it to the grandfather. I showed it to him, and he gave me the nod that it was good. I knew then it was time to go out and search for the animal that I was going to kill at close range. I had to follow the way of the wolves, the way of the predators. I didn't want to take a trophy animal. Not only I couldn't, because that deer would have been too big, too powerful, but it would have also been too much meat for grandfather to consume that winter. It would have been a waste. And after all, the wolves, the major predators, do not prey on the trophy animals. Instead, they prey on the very old, the sick, the injured. And the biggest game we had in the Pine Barrens, of course, was deer. And I remember it was late in August, grandfather gave me the nod to search out the deer that would become the winter meat. I found it within hours. It was absolutely perfect. This deer was a yearling. It had been born that spring. And it was diminutive, just big enough to feed grandfather for the winter once the meat was smoked. But there was also another problem. It had a hip deformity. It couldn't run. It could barely walk. And the only reason it survived was we were in the summer months. And vegetation was succulent. I began to track, follow, stalk that deer for weeks. Every available moment, I wanted to know everything about it. I wanted to know where it and its mother slept, where it drank, its feeding routes, its escape routes. I got to know that deer so well, and they got so used to seeing me around, but yet not harming them, that so frequently they'd walk by a trail that they knew that they'd come along, and I'd stand there. And I reached down and touched that little fawn, and it would never jump away. In fact, there was occasions when they bedded down for the day that I'd actually bed down myself. And I could lift my head and look at that little deer and its mother lifting their head, never looking at me, but looking out for danger, and then go back to sleep during the day. And then I'd follow them at night. My God, I knew that deer well. The end of September, grandfather said, "It is time." Oh my God, this was the moment of honor, the rites of passage. moving from childhood and becoming a hunter, a warrior, a man. I knew exactly where I was going to go. There was this old farmer's field that had overgrown. And there was this small pine in the center of that field that had been struck by lightning, hitting the top, forcing the tree to grow stout branches. Wasn't very tall, but perfect. Because the lower, stouter limbs afforded me a place to stand on, which happened to be right above the deer trail that deer and its mother always used. If I had a watch back then, I could have timed the whole scenario to the moment. But no, I was up in that tree because I wanted everything to go right. Hours before, Grandfather believed firmly in a clean kill. No suffering. Death instant. And I stood on that limb. I could see that trail beneath me. And my plan was this. When that little deer passed under that limb, I was going to drop, ram that short thrusting spear between his shoulder blades, and cut back and forth, severing his spine and stopping his heart. Instant death. A clean kill. An honorable kill. And I remember seeing that mother deer hitting the edge of that field. And she started to feed along the edge. The little one never followed her. It was too long a walk for him to bear. Instead, he went straight, a path that would bring him under the very limb upon which I stood. And I remember seeing his head pass, his neck. There comes a point in survival where you have to let go of your humanness, where you can no longer think, where there just is action and reaction with no restriction in strength or speed. If thought comes into the picture, there is always thought before action and reaction, and it is wrought with restriction. And I let go of my humanness and I dropped, and I could feel that spear go into that deer. And I went to cut, and my spear broke. There is a thing inside a human that reaches back to our primal path, that which is called the animal within, let loose in times of dire survival situations. And I took that deer's neck in my hands. It was crippled but not dead. And I began pounding its head into the ground, blood splattering all over me. And I watched its eyes go cold and gray. I could feel its spirit slip through my fingers. I awoke from this state, hearing my own growls in my throat. And I looked down at this deer, and I realized I knew this deer better than I knew my own brother. That deer trusted me. And now, in the most horrific act of violence, I killed it. Oh, it was so different. So different than releasing that arrow or throwing that throwing stick or having that trap do the dirty work. You're not at the point of death there. But here, feeling that spirit slip through my hands, boy, I knew what death was. I felt it. I began to cry uncontrollably, shake. At first of all, I grew angry at myself, but then I grew angrier at grandfather. I grew enraged. He had built this up to something that it wasn't. This stinking rites of passage was a lie, was vile. I remember picking up my broken spear and throwing that deer up over my shoulder, so light and frail. Could feel the blood running down my chest from its gaping wound in his back. Covered in sweat, trembling with rage, I walked right to grandfather's camp. My ambition, I was going to throw that deer at him and walk out of the woods forever. I wanted none of it. None of it. No rites of passage. No. I was done. And I remember getting to his camp, and there he sat at the other side of the fire, so serene. No blood on his hands. And as I walked into the clearing, his eyes met mine, and his eyes said to me, "Grandson, I've been there." And before I could speak, he lifted that old gnarled finger at me and said, "Grandson, when you can feel the same way about a blade of grass torn from the earth as you do about that little deer, then and only then will you be one with all things. The problem is, grandson, in your spiritual arrogance, you do not hear the cries of the ants that you crush. You do not feel the pain and the bleeding of the trees. You do not hear the wails of suffering in the mice that are killed by your traps." And I realized he was right. I had built in my mind some spiritual hierarchy, like somehow deer were more important than mice, and mice were more important than ants, and ants were more important than grasses. What grandfather was telling me is that they were all important. They all have spirit. That's the year of testing. That's one of many. One of so many. And it took me months to back off of that incident that caused me to look at hunting and life in a whole different way, to appreciate every spark of life out there. Taught me to realize that every tiny grain of sand has a spirit. I realized it was a test. I could have walked forever from the woods. Now, as I said, what I'm trying to do here is lay the foundation of understanding for those supporting prophecies. And I say 4 of them, starting with the stone vision / prophecy from those 4 days of silence, and ending ultimately with hope. Now, I said to you earlier on that the hope is not for you. The hope is for the children of the earth. Those that will make that exodus, those that will run and hide. And I said that your responsibility is to teach, to deliver to them, after all else is done, that prophecy of hope. What does that say? Hope. There is still a choice. There is still that possibility that the human race totally, children of the earth also, be wiped off the face of this planet. Don't you think at the end of these 10 years of purging, of the pain and the suffering that people are going to go through, that to those ones that have run and hidden for 10 years, don't you think they're going to feel that, whoa, there is no hope? Subsequently, that's why that supporting vision of hope. Call it also encouragement. Call it the light at the end of the tunnel. And logically you ask yourself, okay, the children of the earth are going to run to the wild places. And hide. You know, hiding for me is an adventure. It's a vacation. I love it. I mean, I cannot think of anything greater to do than to hide on other people. It's so damn easy. You know, I should devise a game just for Tom Brown. Arm people with high-powered rifles, Uzis, and handguns. Pick a woods, give me a 12 hours head start, and I'll hide on you for a month. That would be a vacation. See me, shoot me. I have fun doing that. All scouts have fun doing that. But you say then, the children of the earth, as they hide, is they toy with their pursuers. Remember, the hunted always has the advantage. As they toy with their pursuers, which in many cases, if the children of the earth are well trained, they will do. They'll do more than toy with them. A lot more. Why should they feel after these 10 years and all of this is wiped off the face of the planet that this disease is gone? Where they had all this fun of sneaking and peeking and running and escaping and evading and living in the lap of luxury in the Garden of Eden. Why should it seem so hopeless that we need a vision, a prophecy, a hope? To understand why, You have to firmly believe in the Spirit that moves through all things, which moves in and through us also. We are truly connected to all things out there. Every tree, every wildflower, every deer, every blade of grass, every grain of sand. But so too are we connected to every city, every other person, whether they believe in what we believe in or not. They are part of us. It's like grandfather said of the Spirit that moves through all things. If one part of that Spirit is sick, is hurting, is lost and searching, then the whole cannot be healthy. Don't you think for 1 minute that with all of that pain and suffering that are going to go on with the mindless masses, the children feeding on the remains of the dead, that the children of the earth, so highly attuned and connected to the Spirit that moves through all things, are not going to also feel it? They're not going to feel some of the anguish, the pain, the guilt? Of course they are. There's a psychological condition. It's called survivor's guilt. That's what they'll feel. Where there's like a horrible plane crash and 2 people survive. The rest die in the fiery crash. These 2 run from that plane, hearing the screams of terror and pain. And for years, they ask themselves, why me? Why was I chosen? Why did I survive? And they actually feel guilty about it. The children of the earth that have run, that have hidden, are going to feel that. Why did we survive? And guess what? You, as elders, will have provided them with the answers. Because, grandchild, you made a choice. You made a choice to live in balance and harmony with the earth. You made a choice to become a caretaker and healer of the earth. Because you've made a choice to follow the Creator, to follow God. Because you've made a choice not to spit in the face of God's gift to us, the earth. That's why you did not perish. As I said, it's your responsibility. You've got to teach them. You've got to lead them. You've got to awaken them. Continuing on with the reading. And it's funny, as I reread this just before we started, there was a publisher's note. But then again, I remembered to that point in time where this occurred. And it wasn't the publisher's mistake, it was my mistake at the time that this transpired. Now remember, Rick had gone. He left the woods. He never made it through that night's camp. He went home. He made a choice. Little did he know the cost of that choice. and he came back after. I remember what grandfather said to me. One of the last things, as Rick, we could hear the concentric rings of Rick approaching camp. Grandfather looked at me in that dead serious look of his and say, "See that Rick knows none of this." He swore me to secrecy. See that Rick, he didn't call him Rick, he called him your brother, knows none of this. We'll get back to that in a moment. But I began to wrestle with the same demons that grandfather wrestled with after he had that vision of the 4 prophecies. You heard me read, you heard me say, grandfather said to me, he wrestled with this self-doubt. And then I think to myself, wow, he went from you may never see this in your lifetime to he knew he'd never see it. He made a huge difference. One old man, one homeless, penniless wanderer, with no usable skills in modern society, I believe changed the course and postponed the inevitable, moving it from you may never see to you will not see. Yet, he questioned it. He was filled with self-doubt. And a combination of I write and he said. Grandfather had had this vision sometime in the 1920s. And now it was 1962. And still there were no great famines and certainly no holes in the sky. I wondered how we could ever tell if there was a hole in the sky or not. For certainly the air was transparent and there could be no way to see a hole in the air. I laughed to myself at a fleeting image of Chicken Little running around the barnyard shouting, "The sky is falling." Certainly I would look just as insane going around shouting that there would be holes in the sky. The whole thing seemed so far-fetched, so impossible. Granted, grandfather had been right in all of his other prophecies, but these were bizarre, even for him. Somewhere in that deep thought, I drifted into what I thought was a sound sleep. Grandfather was going through the same thing when he says, I could possibly convince the shaman of the tribes. You know? So it was kind of nice for me to realize that grandfather was human. That he too was plagued at one time with self-doubt and confusion. Remember, all of this happened after the 4 prophecies, but before those 4 supporting prophecies. I awoke to the deep blackness of the night, startled and feeling that something was watching me. That one little sentence there, I'm going to use eventually as the inroad to the supporting prophecies. I glanced around the parts of the landscape that I could vaguely see, but there was nothing, not a sound, only the feeling of being watched. It was then that I looked up into the sky and saw the blood-red stars shining down through a huge gaping hole, a hole that seemed to be torn from the permeable fabric of the sky. I was pinned to the ground, unable to move, my fear rising in my throat, making it difficult for me to breathe. I knew now that surely this must be the end, the final sign taking hold. Grandfather's prophecies had come true. I grew violently sick to my stomach, but could not retch. My body became numb, cold, and beaded with sweat. I tried to call for Grandfather or Rick, but my scream was silent. That's how out of my mind I was. Rick wasn't in camp. Grandfather had this way of tormenting your dreams, so much so that you could not separate dream from reality a lot of times. You know, I remember so many of these hideous stories that Grandfather would tell Rick and I, or me alone, and he used to take some sadistic delight in doing that, especially when I was alone, of telling me some demonic story of possession and pain and anguish and suffering from a patient and this hideous beast. And then I'd try to go to sleep that night, and it would haunt me all night. So you can imagine what these prophecies did to me. You know what I mean? They stuck with me. And at the time, I didn't realize that I was in a dream. But looking back at that, that wasn't a dream. That was in that area between dream and vision. Call it a visionary dream. It was not a nightmare. It was certainly not nonsensical. It had impact. It awakened me. It planted a seed. A voice broke the silence, a voice much like Grandfather's, but very different. It sounded as if Grandfather had grown 20 years older and more hoarse. Now, here's the interesting thing here, because much later on, I recounted this voice to Grandfather. And Grandfather asked me questions about this voice. And for instance, how did he say such and such? Turns out that the voice that spoke to me that night was the warrior spirit. The same spirit that spoke to Grandfather. He had some quirks in his language that were very prominent. And both Grandfather and I realized at the same time that I had been in contact with this warrior, this spirit, which startled Grandfather in a way, I think. Yet somehow and paradoxically, he was almost expecting it. But I don't think at that early a date. I think he suspected that I was going to contact this thing much later. This entity, this spirit. I shouldn't call it a thing or it'll kick my butt. It spoke to me saying, "How can you not believe the holes in the sky, the stars that bleed, or the famine? You have borne witness to the impossible before, and you see the impossible happen each day all around you. Yet you say that you cannot believe? As you have lived, you have known that faith is the most powerful force on earth and in the heavens. Faith needs no fact or reason, transcends the laws of science. Faith is the most powerful. Because you cannot understand how these things can happen or how to bear witness of these things, your faith is shaken and you cannot fully accept them. This same warrior who has lived in the temples of wilderness and touched God, who has seen and lived the power of vision and spirit, now cannot comprehend the prophecies set before you? Why then can you not now transcend flesh and mind and accept these things? That spirit pointed out to me something very important. First of all, I was searching, lusting would be a better word, craving, how these things could happen, the mechanisms behind it, the encyclopedic definition of why holes are going to occur in the sky. As if in order to validate them, I had to have some god of science or technology or medicine say that they could happen. They did, it just took a while. The second thing was how to bear witness of these things, how to tell people of them. You can imagine my dilemma, grandfather's dilemma, holes in the sky. Me with my analogy of Chicken Little running through a barnyard, the sky is falling. Who the hell is going to believe that? You imagine me rocking right out now and hitting somebody in front of that bar across the street there and saying, hey, someday here pretty quick, the sky is going to turn red day and night. The stars are going to bleed the fires of Armageddon. What do you think he's going to say? Yeah, right. Yeah, right. There's no way to convince. But there's an education process. It's long, it's labored. Just like the education process grandfather put me through. You put yourself through. All of you. Oh, no, hey, I'm not so pretentious to believe that your entire spiritual path and everything else started with me or reading a book or reading about grandfather. No. It started the day you realized there's something more to life than 9 to 5, flesh and blood, eating and sleeping. You began to sense things, hear things, feel things that were outside what most people believe is the human condition. You realize there's a hell of a lot more out there. You began to grow aware. You began to look close and see and feel and understand the miracles that surround you every day. You prepared your soils to understand this. And like me, like grandfather, you're scratching your head up to a point saying, how can I teach people this? How can I warn them? How can I make a difference? And we're always wrestling with how. Oh my God, I remember back when. how's there going to be holes in the sky? What's going to cause it? Seeking some god of science to explain it for me. Well, lo and behold, there was the holes. And all of a sudden, the gods of science said, well, it's in our ozone layer. Well, what's causing them? Well, as near as we can figure, fluorocarbons. There was the explanation. It just happened to be after the holes were discovered. Then we needed an explanation. So are we not in the same place right now looking toward those stars, that sky that will someday turn red? Some people say, well, maybe it's a comet, meteorite. Could very well be, gang. But it states in that prophecy that these are not the color, this red is not the color of nature, it is the color of man. If comets or meteorites or whatever are involved, then it does something to the atmosphere to ignite the crap that we put up there to make this bizarre, unnatural color of red. And we realize that it's not the color of nature, it is the color of man. I have to laugh when people talk about beautiful sunsets and the colors and everything else in sunsets. The most colorful sunsets and sunrises are usually in places where it is the most polluted. Because the sun has more garbage to reflect off of. So I look at trying to find an explanation to why the holes in the sky, why is the sky going to turn red, as a waste of time. The more we entertain hypothetical questions like that and start taking our valuable spiritual time to try to figure them out, start to sit off in a corner thinking about them instead of doing something to prevent them, that's when it gets dangerous. That's when it gets absurd. That's when we're wasting time. I mean, yeah, I couldn't accept that the holes were going to form. How the hell was anybody going to see them anyway? How do we know they're even there? Thank God I didn't waste too much time, not after this warrior spirit gave me a wake-up call. What he was saying is, who cares how they're made? Don't waste your time. Who cares how you're going to get the message out? Just get it out. That's what the Spirit was saying. Like I tell people, I worked like hell. I tried to reach as many people as possible in the early days of the tracker school. But then the holes in the sky were discovered. Then I really started to work hard, if there was such a thing. That was one hell of a wake-up call. As much as I said I believed it was going to happen, there was that little tiny shred of doubt. Oh, it was small, probably on a molecular or atomic level. But I remember when those first reports came in, I was a cross between terrorized and panic-stricken, and all I could do was walk into the woods and fall on my knees and beg the forgiveness of the Creator and the spirit world for having one shred of doubt. I awoke terrorized more than I had ever remembered being in my life. I ran blindly from camp, screaming grandfather's name, trying desperately to leave what I had just dreamed or witnessed. I did not know which. I fell crashing through the thick brush and ended up on my back at the bottom of the hill. It was then that I noticed that the stars in the sky were clear and that the landscape had returned to normal. I could see the fissure of dawn appearing on the distant horizon, and I felt whole again. The fear had vanished, but I did not know why. What I did notice was a change in my thinking, a deep but subtle change. I had somehow accepted the 4 prophecies as a very possible future and didn't know how. But somehow I was going to keep them from becoming reality. Relaxed now, I drifted off to a deep sleep exactly where I had fallen. That may not sound like much to you, but it made one hell of a difference to me. That was a major turning point in my life that I just blew off with one simple sentence. But somehow, I was going to keep them from becoming reality. Just that single-minded focus. That willingness to sacrifice everything to keep those prophecies from becoming reality was life-changing, was visionary in proportion. And you know, at the time, I didn't realize it. I didn't realize how that small change in thinking would make such an impact in my life. Not at all. Maybe it would have been better at that moment for the Creator to send down the archangels trumpeting with white-winged buffaloes with dancing naked maidens on their back. And then I would have said, whoa, that just changed my whole damn life. Somehow, I was going to make a difference. Somehow, those prophecies were not going to come true. I didn't know how. I didn't know how. You know what? I didn't care. I did not care. I didn't care how those holes in the sky appeared. I didn't care how those stars were going to bleed the fires of Armageddon. I didn't care how I was going to awaken people. But I was going to do it. I was going to do it. You know what the cool thing is? I've never listened to one of these tapes. Not the grandfather book, nothing. Not any tape we've ever I hate my voice. How many people out there hate their own voice when you hear it on a tape? I mean, it's the human condition. I don't know. Maybe the Creator just puts that little mechanism in our heads that you must hate your own voice. Could start it out like we do the taping. I know what you're going to do with them. Outtakes. Tracker. Remember, you're in them. Continuing with this, and again, never lose sight that what I'm saying here, what I have said here, is laying that foundation to understand fully those supporting prophecies, those visions that expand and empower those basic 4 prophecies of man's destruction. The sleep experienced after being physically and spiritually exhausted can be deep and forgetful. I awoke well into the morning, still shaken from the experience of the past night, still in the same place I had fallen. There was a certain clarity to my thinking, and I felt refreshed. I could, however, feel the burden of the 4 prophecies, but the fear was no longer terror, just a healthy fear that had become a driving force. This is the change I talked about. That resolve, that one sentence that from that point on forever changed my life. And it just wasn't caring anymore of how this could be explained scientifically, how this could happen, or how I was even going to convey this message. It just was that determination that, damn it, I am going to convey this message. I don't care how. I wandered back up to the camp, still shaken and sporting a healthy assortment of new scars from my panicked run. Grandfather sat at camp patiently waiting for me, and I could feel that he knew what had happened to me during the night. Again, my thoughts were transparent, and I felt a little humbled because of my disbelief. Before I spoke, Grandfather hushed me to silence, saying, "You wonder why I have passed down these visions to you and what you should do with that knowledge." Notice he didn't again say, you and Rick. You. Now, it was at that point, and, like I say, I don't tell a story. I relive it. I go back in my mind, in my heart, to that event, and it's not a series of memories. Just when I said that, just when I read that to you, I could smell that pine air. I could smell that fading fire, the coals. I could feel that ground beneath my feet. I could relive it all, and did. That's why oftentimes, if you listen to very carefully to what I'm saying, I drift from past tense to now all too frequently. All too frequently. And that thought, when he said, "Why I have passed down these visions to you," I felt at that moment, yes, the horrible vacancy, the absence of Rick. But along with that came at that moment that sense of aloneness. And for that moment, I could empathize with Grandfather, how that man must have felt to have carried that vision of the 4 prophecies that was delivered to him with such impact, such power, for all of those years up until 1962. And I remember feeling that burden. that he must have carried with him. How he must have been tormented by it. How I'm tormented by it. Still to this day. And I thought to myself, wow, since grandfather passed it down to me, that must have relieved him of some of the responsibility. I know my thoughts then. He's got to feel a little better that he's got someone else on board, even though I was 12 years old. But let me tell you, it did not take away any of that responsibility from him. It only increased it. You see, that's what I originally thought. As I started to pass down these prophecies to my group Coyote Thunder, and then finally in this book, I figured, okay, now I'm going to be able to breathe a little bit. It's going to alleviate some of the urgency. I got more people working for it. No. The exact opposite has happened. I feel even more pressure. People say, well, why would you feel more pressure? Because you're part of fulfilling yet another minor prophecy. When I start passing these down in this manner, we are that much closer to the red skies. You told me 10 years ago I'd be doing this in this way, spelling this out? Yeah, right. I'd never have believed you. Never come close to believing you that this could happen. I could see it when I was 80 years old, 3 years away from ground zero. But now, as I told you, you must not only work for your own spiritual enlightenment, but also for the spiritual enlightenment of all of mankind. For to run and hide, to think only of oneself, and not to have love and compassion for all of man is to deny part of yourself. As I said, that is why the prophecy of hope, because we're connected. How many great religions have basically come out and said in one form or another, love thine enemy? Because they realize that that enemy is actually part of ourselves. Man is part of the Spirit that moves through all things, and when one part of that Spirit is sick, then all are sick. And when one part of that Spirit dies, then part of self dies. These visions, these 4 prophecies, are the things you should work to resolve, things that lie beyond the self. Thus, by working to keep these prophecies and visions from becoming reality and to make the world whole again, we become dedicated to something greater than self, and your spiritual life becomes visible and full. You do not run away from your responsibility. See, that was the big thing in my life then. As far as I was concerned, you weren't never going to get me out of the woods. That was my sanctuary. That was my heaven. That was my temple. Still is. And I'd argue with grandfather about having to come out of the woods to teach. And as he said, if one part is sick, then all is sick. Grandfather then ended the conversation and wandered out of camp, leaving me to my thoughts. Until this point, I had never realized how adamant he was about bringing the philosophy of the earth out into civilization. It wasn't just the philosophy of the earth, it was the prophecies of destruction, mind you. Yet grandfather never ventured very far out of the wilderness, nor did he go out of his way to teach his philosophy, except to a select few individuals. And when I say that, I mean, and very little, only what they could bear. I wondered why. He then told me that someday I had to take what I knew out into the world of man, when he didn't even follow what he preached. His voice broke the silence of my thoughts, saying, "The choice to go back to the world of man is not yours or mine. It is the world of spirit, of God, that sends us, each to his capacity, each in his own way. I am living my vision and teaching the way that vision dictates, and someday you must do the same. But how will I know what to teach, where to go, and who to reach with this teaching?" I asked. "The way and the means will be made manifest through vision and from the direction of the world of spirit," grandfather said. "So make no concern about these things, for to a person living beyond his own spiritual selfishness, the way becomes clear. Thus, if a person is attuned to the world of spirit, the world of vision, and working for things beyond his or herself, then the path and the time to act becomes clear. Until then, allow the spirit of the earth and the Creator to teach you, and the vision quest to guide, and all else will become reality." That further confirmed that first encounter I had with the warrior spirit, where that spirit essentially said, "Don't worry about explaining how this could happen. Don't worry about how you are going to take this message." And the fruit of that conversation came at that night, that morning after that horrendous night, where something changed within me because I decided I don't care how, why, but I'm going to prevent that from happening. And this was grandfather's confirmation. But still, there was a part of me that remained selfish. Just like there was a part of me, that tiny shred, that molecular structure that held on to that self-doubt, that general doubt about the holes in the sky. There was still part of me that resented coming back to the flesh. I then told grandfather that it didn't seem fair that a man could not live his life in wilderness if that was his choice. Grandfather responded emphatically, saying, in these desperate times, when the earth is dying, there can be no rest, no running away, for each of us in our own way must work to change the probable future of mankind. For if modern man destroys himself, then we are personally responsible, and we are destroyed also. Each then is accountable for the future. That's what so troubled me. And as I said so many times before, I say it on the first night of a standard class, under the heading of Who is Tom Brown? I tell people the Tom Brown that you read about in these books, the one who went crazy and ran wild and free in wilderness, is dead. Oh, he still exists inside me, waiting to get out once in a while. But he exists inside of me as a dream. Like I tell classes, I still have those dreams, but I know I can't ever live them. Yeah, I would love to go to Montana, to build a cabin there from the earth and live off the land in perfect balance and harmony. I would love to have a thatched shack in Costa Rica and live in the jungles without time and destination and expectation. But I can't. As I tell people, a dream is selfish. A dream is what you want. A vision, on the other hand, is a command from the Creator. And there's nothing spoken by the elders that says you have to like it. So oftentimes you get this love-hate relationship with a vision. Because at times you know it's killing you. But you know you have no other choice, because as grandfather said, as the elders have spoken, a man or a woman not living their vision is dead. So there is no choice. There is no choice. I think that's the time that the Creator subsequently removes choice from us. We have a choice to do everything in our lives, but when we make that final choice to follow our vision, our choice is no longer our own. We don't say, I want to. We listen and say, what do you want me to do? I learned a profound lesson when grandfather shifted that vision, that prophecy, from you may never to you will never. That grand vision, and it's in my top 5 visions of when I was changed by those prophecies, and at that point, I didn't care how these things are going to happen or how I was going to get this message out. I just knew I'd do everything in my power to make a difference. That was a grand vision. So each of us, every day, as part of the Spirit that moves through all things, has a choice to make a difference. Because sometimes the smallest things are the most powerful. The smallest things are the most powerful. Especially concerning the 4 prophecies of man's destruction. Last I heard, viruses and bacteria are very small and very lethal.